Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from the bunker, and in this video we simply must talk about the 2019 service year report, which has finally, within the last 2 or 3 days, been made available to Jehovah's Witnesses. I say finally because there was an article put out in November indicating that the numbers were ready. This is November 13th, 2019, when Jehovah's Witnesses were given a teaser that the 2019 service year report includes largest baptismal figure in 20 years. So what's happened here is Watchtower has the figures at their disposal as of November 13th, 2019. And rather than giving the figures, divulging them, letting people mull over them and draw their own conclusions, Watchtower has cherry-picked a figure that looks impressive, and they've decided to use it for motivational purposes. So we read on, "We are thrilled to announce that during the 2019 service year, more than 300,000 individuals were baptized as Jehovah's Witnesses. This is the first time since 1999 that the number baptized has exceeded 300,000. We praise Jehovah for blessing our wholehearted preaching and disciple-making work." The fact that they managed to baptize over 300,000 people is cause to praise Jehovah for blessing the wholehearted preaching and disciple-making work. Now, when this article was released, I immediately thought, that's interesting. What is it that they don't want us to know? Or what is it that they don't want Jehovah's Witnesses to focus on if they're jumping up and down about 303,866 baptized? Well, now that the figures have finally been released, I can tell you, and will tell you, as this video progresses. But first of all, let's take a look at the 2019 grand totals. So, branches of Jehovah's Witnesses, 87. That's interesting because it seems to have finally leveled off. There was a period in the last 10 years when the number of branches reduced dramatically as part of organizational downsizing. There were some years where, I forget the exact numbers, but there were lots of branches being closed so that Watchtower could manage its overheads more effectively. And for 2019, they report 87. Well, that's the same as the previous year. In 2017, the number was 90. So that initial wave of downsizing does seem to have halted for the time being, at least as far as branches are concerned. Number of lands reporting 240, that's the same as for the last few years. Total congregations 119,712. For the previous year it was 119,954, and for the year before that 120,053. So there's clearly a downwards trend in terms of the total number of congregations. Jehovah's Witnesses or Watchtower would say, well, this is due to more efficient use of kingdom halls and congregations being merged to make more efficient use of auditorium space. Well, fair enough. But as we're going to see, the figures, the actual growth figures themselves indicate that growth is stagnating. So if the number of congregations has very slightly fallen over the last 3 years and you have stagnant growth, again, it just doesn't bode well for an organization that's supposedly being blessed by Jehovah in its preaching work, as we established from that initial article I read you. Memorial partakers worldwide, the figure for 2019 was 20,526. That's an increase from the previous year when it was 19,500. The year before that, 18,500. So it's still going up. I know this is a metric that excites some people We're talking here about a group of people who were once considered the faithful slave before the new light in 2012, that the governing body alone was the faithful slave rather than the anointed as a whole. I'm honestly not all that interested in how many Jehovah's Witnesses believe they're going to go to heaven with the governing body, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, the numbers are continuing to go up and have been going up. I think it was from 2007 when they ditched the teaching about 1935. So more and more Jehovah's Witnesses believe they're going to be in heaven with the governing body. Peak publishers, we said 8.6 or 8.7 million, I should say. Average publishers preaching per month is 8.5. Interestingly, for the 2019 service year report, Watchtower has published the average publisher numbers per country. It used the opportunity for the 2017 and 2018 reports, which were only published online because the last yearbook to be printed was the 2017 yearbook. We haven't had a yearbook since then. And Watchtower used the opportunity of ditching the print copy to give witnesses slightly less information. So for the 2017 and 2018 service year reports, witnesses were in the dark per country as to what the average totals were. That's changed now for the 2019 reports, and we're back to knowing what the average publisher numbers per country are. And I prefer those numbers because I'm not really interested in what peak number of publishers a given country managed to hit in the year. The average is clearly a more meaningful number. My theory is that Watchtower ditched the number for 2017 and 2018 because it felt that the peak numbers were more impressive, which they're always going to be. But I think they've brought the average numbers back for the 2019 service year report. I would suggest, because it's possible to have a more impressive growth percentage from the average numbers than from the peak numbers. And indeed, for 2019, they're telling us that the growth percentage of Jehovah's Witnesses was 1.3%. When you run the same calculations for all the countries based on the peak numbers, you arrive at a slightly smaller figure of 1.2%. So again, this is just conjecture on my part. You would have to ask Watchtower why for a 2-year window they kept witnesses in the dark on the average publisher numbers. But I would suggest it was purely about wanting the most impressive percentage increase. And so for 2019, they thought, actually, let's give the 1.3% and reinsert all of the average figures to support it, because we're not so pleased with the percentage we get from the peak numbers, which again is 1.2. And let's think again about that 1.3%. It really is not that impressive when you consider that for the last 2 years prior to 2019, 2017 and 2018, it was 1.4%. It's now on 1.3%, or again 1.2% if you use the peak figures. These are not numbers to be jumping up and down about. And remember, we had that article where Watchtower was saying that this 20-year high of 303,000 baptisms was evidence of Jehovah's blessing on the organization. They've had a 20-year high in terms of baptisms, and they've still got a worse growth percentage than they had in the previous 2 years. That's why I think Watchtower has been sluggish to share the service year reports, and has been very careful about how it spun the whole thing in terms of PR for rank and file witnesses. It's desperate for witnesses to think that there's this rosy picture when it comes to the preaching work. So they've cherry-picked this one seemingly good statistic, But when you take that 303,000 baptisms and put it against the growth figures for the last 3 years, what it shows is that even though more witnesses are getting baptized, and let's be honest, these baptisms will be mostly Jehovah's Witness children, they're still stagnating in growth. They've still managed only 1.3% or 1.2%, depending on which figures you use, which means, of course, that more people are leaving. We don't know exactly how many people are leaving. We can give rough guesses based on the figures, but more baptisms, weaker growth means more people leaving, which is of course very encouraging. Average Pioneer publishers each month, 1,277,738. That's up slightly from the previous year when it was 1,268,000 rounded up, and in 2017 the same figure was 1,250,000 rounded up. So even with more pioneers actively trying to bring people into the organization, again, they're getting stagnant growth. And this is even more evident when you look at the number of hours spent in the field, spent preaching, spent trying to recruit. We're talking about witnesses doing car witnessing. We're talking about witnesses doing door-to-door preaching, showing people videos, you name it. The total number of hours spent doing this for 2019 was 2,088,000,000. For 2018, it was 2,074.6 million, and for 2017 it was 2,046 million. So the number of hours is going up and up and up, but with increasingly disappointing results. And this apparently is good. This apparently is evidence that Jehovah is blessing the work. Now, I've shown you briefly some of the highlights from the 2019 grand totals. I think it's worthwhile, though, looking at the world picture in terms of how witnesses are doing in various different countries. Now, this can be challenging for a short video because obviously there are 240 lands where Jehovah's Witnesses are reporting. I'm clearly not going to go into a country-by-country summary of how witnesses are doing in these lands. But if you watched my review of the 2018 service year report, you'll remember that I was able to show that in a number of countries, particularly half of Europe, witnesses were in retreat. The number of peak Jehovah's Witness publishers was in decline. I'm absolutely thrilled to say that that trend has not only continued, you could say it's increased. What I decided to do was copy-paste the 2019 figures, the 2018 figures, and the 2017 figures into a spreadsheet and run some calculations to figure out which countries are in decline, because this isn't immediately obvious when you look at the tables that Watchtower produces, because Watchtower will give no number at all in terms of percentage increase or decrease if it's anywhere between 1% in the positive and 1% in the negative. So in other words, if it's minus 0.5%, which is still significant if it's a large country, Watchtower will show no number at all. So they'll just leave you guessing. So I wanted to find out exactly which countries are in decline, specifically larger countries with populations of more than 1 million. So if your country is in decline and I haven't mentioned you in this video, I'm sorry. It's just because your country isn't quite big enough. But if you're watching this from a country with more than 1 million population, then I have considered you for the following figures. So for 2017, there were 37 such countries that were in decline in terms of peak publisher numbers. For 2018, that number rose slightly to 38. For 2019, the figure has gone up to 44. So 44 large countries around the world with populations of more than 1 million posted reductions in Jehovah's Witness numbers based on the peak figures in 2019. And I think that is wonderful news. Now, probably if you're anything like me, you want to know which countries these are. Well, first of all, let me take you back to 2017. We're looking now at a map of the world in 2017. The countries in dark grey are the countries where Jehovah's Witnesses are under ban. So you can see there Russia, China, Iraq, Iran, most of North Africa, etc. So that's dark grey. The red are countries where for 2017 Jehovah's Witnesses reported decreases over their 2016 peak publisher numbers. And rather than list through all the countries, you'll see in the scrolling title at the bottom exactly which countries these were, again with populations of over 1 million for 2017. It's not amazing, but it's a start. And as you can see there, and as I mentioned earlier, Europe does seem to be the hub of this resistance, you could say. The hub of this pushback against control, fear, indoctrination on the part of Watchtower. Particularly Eastern Europe, it just feels as though there's something in the DNA of Eastern Europeans that says, look, we just don't want to be controlled, thank you. We don't want cult nonsense. So that's Europe, but you'll see even in other parts of the world, such as Jamaica, such as Puerto Rico, such as Cuba, such as Mali, such as Gambia, such as Liberia, such as Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, Japan. It's not just Europe. Something's going on in other countries as well, where people are thinking, I had enough of this. It's clearly wrong. The predictions are clearly not coming to pass. Let's just move on. So this is starting to happen. Now let's take a look at the picture in 2018. And you can see that it's flickered somewhat. Some countries have come back out of reverse. Other countries have gone into reverse. So you have there Sudan, Chad and Cote d'Ivoire in Africa. You also have Venezuela over in South America. You have El Salvador in Central America joining Jamaica and Cuba and Puerto Rico. I think this year they also had Haiti in decline. You still have that nucleus of resistance going on in Eastern Europe, going all the way down to Greece. And then in Asia, you have both Kazakhstan and Mongolia for 2018 in decline, and also down there in Bangladesh, albeit it's a very small population of Jehovah's Witnesses in Bangladesh, so any fluctuation in those numbers isn't to be read into too much. But let's move forward to 2019, and wow, immediately we can see more countries. We can see that difference between the 38 countries in decline in 2018 and the 44 in 2019. Now, I should just confess that I coloured in Greenland, even though Greenland isn't a large country. It just felt wrong to not colour it in when it takes up so much space on the map, and it was indeed one of the countries, one of the smaller countries that went into decline in 2019. So apologies if any of you think that that's a bit untoward. But you have there Canada, a bit close to home for Watchtower, don't you think? Canada's in decline, and still you have Venezuela there in South America, not looking good at all. In fact, it should just be noted that the numbers for Venezuela were staggering. Watchtower recorded a -4% decrease in average publisher figures, if you use the peak figures, which again is all I have at my disposal because of that 2-year black spot, the percentage decrease was actually minus 7.42%, or 10,990 fewer publishers in Venezuela. That, for me, in a single year, is unprecedented. And joy of joys, you have South Africa, Niger, Botswana, Gambia, and South Sudan all reporting minuses. In Africa, traditionally Watchtower relies on Africa as the engine of growth for the entire organisation, exploiting the fact that in many countries in Africa, they're relatively behind when it comes to the availability of the internet. So Watchtower's looking at Africa thinking, come on, prop up the numbers for the globe. And yet in several African countries, witnesses are saying, enough of this. We've really had enough of being lied to, thank you. And also there you have Pakistan, again you have Japan. This year you also had a reduction in New Zealand. This is really encouraging news as far as I'm concerned. Watchtower doesn't want Jehovah's Witnesses to see this. It doesn't want Jehovah's Witnesses to compare 1 year report with the previous year and the year before to get a picture of what's going on globally. But when you do that, when you start to really drill down and find out what's going on in these countries, you find out that it's not the rosy picture that Watchtower would have us believe. And to be honest, there's a little bit of cooking the books going on. I know some of you postulate, they will say, look, Lloyd, you're wrong to take these figures seriously at all. Of course Watchtower's going to be cooking the books. Of course they're going to be lying. And my attitude towards that claim is fair enough. I agree with you. It's not beyond Watchtower to lie about their figures. But I'm still going to take them at face value, if only to show witnesses I'm willing to engage based on the figures themselves. And number two, even if Watchtower is cooking the books, even if Watchtower is inflating the figures, they're going to reach a point where doing so is simply unsustainable. Because publishers in a certain country will be able to tell, look, we don't know where you're getting this many thousand publishers from, because that's simply not what we're seeing when we go to our conventions. There's only so much that Watchtower can do that. So I tend to think that it's in Watchtower's interests not to go down that road, not to engage in those dark arts, or to at least limit the extent to which they do that. But they are doing it to at least some extent. I've mentioned the kind of cup and ball game that's going on when it comes to the average figures versus the peak figures, and that manifests itself in Ireland. When you look at the country and territory report figures for Ireland, Watchtower is claiming that the country had a 2% increase. Again, I'm guessing that they're going off the average figures, which again they are withholding from us because they didn't tell us what the average figures were in 2018 or 2017. Hopefully those figures will become available eventually. And yes, it's conceivable that based purely on the average figures, Ireland had a 2% increase. But you'll see on my map of the world, Ireland is coloured red, and that's because I can only go off the peak figures for continuity. And when you look at the peak figures for 2019, Ireland shrunk by 2 publishers. So they reported 7,059 peak publishers for 2019 and 7,061 peak publishers for 2018. So that's why, in case you're wondering, Ireland is red on my map. even though Watchtower is claiming a 2% increase. So I can only go off, again, the peak figures. I wish I could use the average figures for continuity, but you'll have to ask Watchtower why they've withheld those figures for 2 years. Again, I think I can figure out why. And finally, just before I finish the video, I want to talk about the United States. Obviously, lots of you watching this video will be from the United States, or indeed in the United States. And if you saw the Watchtower in Focus 2019 review live stream, you might have seen the part at the end where we learn of these figures, and there's this mad scramble to run a quick analysis of them. And initially we thought that the United States had grown by 30,000 publishers. We were basing this purely on how people were commenting. And I said, well, 30,000 for a country as big as the United States isn't that big a deal. Apparently it would have been a big deal, but it wasn't actually 30,000. It wasn't even 3,000 as we came to think it was, again based on the comments in the live stream. The United States grew in 2019 by only 2,177 publishers, which, when you consider that the United States is, number one, the heartland of the religion. It's where it all began. It's where the governing body is located. It's where all of the organization's history really is. For a country that makes up such a sizable chunk of the Jehovah's Witness population, we're talking 1.2 million publishers, peak publishers in the United States. For them to only grow by 2,177, I think someone commented that would have been children. And I agree. When we're talking baptisms, when we're talking growth, in countries like the United States, where people have access to the internet and they can figure out very quickly just how toxic Jehovah's Witnesses are, when you look at that figure of 2,177, you're thinking, it's kids. It's mostly kids. And when you think about it, wow, despite all of the advancements, despite all of the new initiatives, JW Broadcasting, CART Witnessing, JW.org, we're going to show videos in our Kingdom halls, we're going to try all these different initiatives. And despite all of that, the heartland of the religion is only growing by a couple of thousand in a given year. But what's interesting is it gets even worse the further you go back. So the same figure for 2018 was slightly more, 2,584 publisher increase. But for 2017, it was only 684. The increase in peak publishers from 2016 to 2017 was 684. So I was jumping up and down in the Watchtower in Focus live stream, getting all excited that it was only, I thought, 3,000. And in actual fact, that's quite an improvement based on how terrible the growth has been in the United States in past years. And when you look at Canada going into decline, just over the border, and you look at countries in South America and Central America, again where Watchtower is traditionally strong, countries in Africa where Watchtower is relying on the general population not having the same kind of access to online resources. Even in Africa, you have countries like South Africa posting declines. It's just not looking positive if you're in the shoes of the governing body. So I've got a big smile on my face having gone over these figures. Hopefully you will feel positive about them as well, depending of course on how you feel about Jehovah's Witnesses and Watchtower. I will put links to my maps in the description in case you want to download my maps. And I plan to make this a regular feature each year where I'll keep up to date in which countries are going into decline. I can only say, speaking for myself, I'm very proud that both my adoptive country, Croatia, and the country of my birth, Britain, are both very much in decline as of 2019. In fact, for Britain, they recorded a decrease of 1.97%, which translates to 2,754 fewer Jehovah's Witnesses. That is phenomenal. Thousands fewer Jehovah's Witnesses in Britain in 2019 compared to the previous year. And as for Croatia, Croatia is in quite a unique little club of 20 countries that have posted reductions in peak Jehovah's Witness numbers for 3 consecutive years. So in case you're wondering, those 20 countries are Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Cuba, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Hungary, Jamaica, Japan, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sweden, and Ukraine. These are 20 countries that for the last 3 years have posted declines in the number of Jehovah's Witnesses. The organisation is going nowhere in these countries, and I'm very proud to live in one of them. And from Croatia, it's time for me to bid you farewell. I just want to again wish all of you a very happy and prosperous 2020. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget that you can watch more like it right here on the John Cedars channel. So please don't forget to subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.